For years, I've been looking at humanitarianism in a critical way, but I can't rarely can I convince somebody that humanitarianism is just replete with problems and with violence. So maybe
Mhm.
you can say a little bit about that.
This is a very interesting topic to engage in, particularly in the African continent, in
Yeah.
which humanitarianism has had such a colonial origin, right? And in which African states and African people's rights were sort of so the precursor to humanitarian workers were missionaries, right?
Welcome, Mohammed Abumaye, to the Radical Futures podcast. Thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and I'm very excited to talk about your book. You're a scholar and a writer, and I believe you teach as well. You're an assistant professor at Ohio State University, and your book is called Black Muslim Refugee: Militarism, Policing, and Somali American Resistance to State Violence. It was published recently by the University of California Press. It's a really powerful and timely work, since we're seeing a sort of exponential increase, as you know, in the brutality of border regimes worldwide. And of course, like a violent disregard for migrants and refugees, rendering these populations more and more precarious. And at the end of the day, your book focuses, in my mind, on two things: policing, US policing, and US militarism, especially as it impacts the Somali community in Somalia and the US, and the sort of relationships between that. So, before I sort of give long explanations about your book, one of the things I loved reading in your book was the sort of sense of the personal. You interweave your own story, your family story in there, even though it's an academic book, and then you have tons of interviews that shape the book, interviews with activists, younger, older Somalis involved in various movements. So there is a sort of personal story element in it. So I just wanted to start there. How did the book come about? I imagine there are personal reasons for writing it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that really important question. I could say I've been writing this book almost my whole life, right? Because it really stems from my own family's experiences, having as a child lived through the Civil War, fled to Kenya, um, and then received resettlement to the United States. We were resettled by the World Relief Organization. And so when I pursued graduate school in academia, I started to really ask these questions about structural inequities, right?
Mm-hmm.
State violence against immigrants and refugees, and then colonialism broadly, right? And so these were sort of the themes that really resonated with me. And it is from sort of my own family's journey that I started to really question Somali refugees' migration to the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not just the violence that Somalis experience across multiple spaces, Kenya, Somalia, and the United States, but also the ways in which Somalis have found a way to resist that violence and to build life and homes in the context of deprivation, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's something I witnessed in my own family, right? The ways in which we came together, we organized, we built lives, we built community without sort of and very little state intervention, and that intervention was often violent, right? And so that's sort of how my own um, personal biography really shaped the kind of scholar I wanted to be and
Mm-hmm.
the direction of the book.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a great answer, and you have a lot of very, I would say, shocking, because, but what I want to say are sort of heartbreaking things that you say about the Somali population, in general and the existence of militarization and policing that the Somali community in Somalia, and then when they go to other places, keep on experiencing. And you have this line that really struck me. You said, from colonialism to a dictatorship, Somalis kept trading one form of unfreedom for another. And part of what you're also then building out is the idea of the presence of militarized policing that has become part and parcel of Somali refugees that are resettled in San Diego, which is the place that you look
Mhm.
at particularly. But the fact that they have been targets of militarized violence before that, with the U.S. bombings and horrifying interventions in Somalia itself. And then, of course, as they move to refugee camps and so on and so forth. So, can we talk a little bit about this idea of unfreedom? Because you have a bit of a history in there as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And although my book doesn't directly address this in this way, it's really particularly this form of unfreedom as it manifests through militarized violence, right? Militarized policing, right? The Said Barre dictatorship was
Yeah,
a form of militarized policing, right? As he had sort of it was a military state, right? And then the colonial regime was also militarized policing, right? And so part of what I was trying to say, although my particular focus is on the U.S. intervention in Somalia, that
hmm,
form of violence, is to say that Somalis have a long history of experiencing exploitation and state violence, right?
mm,
And denial of human rights that didn't manifest in Dadaab only, right, or begin in Dadaab or begin in the United States, but that it actually has a much longer history, and that this has been um, that this history of unfreedom is also followed and shadowed by, on the other side, a history of Somali resistance to unfreedom, right? And
absolutely.
and 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 that's why I focus on interviewing elders and younger activists to show how the older generation has transferred that knowledge of resistance and organizing to the younger generation, and that there is this sort of what historians call longue durée, the ongoing effects of on freedom over the course of decades,
Hmm.
and almost a century of colonialism, right? And so,
Absolutely.
and the other side of that as well that my work does, and why I focus so much on interviewing Somali activists, organizers, and community members, is that that knowledge of on freedom and state violence against Somalis is oftentimes not visible to the broader global public, right?
Hmm.
It manifests sometimes in secret, right, with U.S. bombings, disappearances of people, and so how I try to argue that um, for Somali refugee epistemology, that Somalis have forms of knowledge that expose the hidden workings of state violence, right?
Yeah.
And so the book is supposed to end with this hope that there can be a future in which Somali life is not defined by unfreedom, defined
Absolutely.
by militarized violence, right? And the key to that is sort of the younger generation and the tremendous organizing that's happening
Hmm.
within the Somali diaspora, right?
Yeah.
Even though I focus specifically on San Diego as one site of the sort of global Somali diaspora.
Yeah. And I think to talk a little bit about this notion of resistance, modes of creating sort of lateral, less visible circuits of information between the communities, finding ways to stay together, finding ways to resist this constant policing. You kind of seem to turn to the Black Lives Matter movement
Mhm. Mhm.
as a sort of turning point, as a sort of instrumental moment. Can you say a little bit, first of all, about the Somali community in San Diego? When did they get there? And what changed with the Black Lives Matter movement for this particular community?
San Diego is so multifaceted site. So one reason why it's an important site to think of Somali refugees is one thing that my book was trying to do is argue critically that U.S. imperialism is the condition of possibility for the Somali civil war and Somali refugee migration. And San
Hmm.
Diego is a great site because it hosts 5 U.S. military bases, but is also the largest refugee resettling city in the state of California, right? And so refugees that are displaced because of US wars abroad from Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, and Somalia are all in this location, right? So to really argue that US militarism creates refugees, right? That's oftentimes not
Hmm.
a visible sight. But my interrogation of Black Lives Matter is an intervention into our normative understandings of what blackness and who black people are. So when Somalis first arrived to San Diego in 1990, one of the first waves, right? This was the height of the war on drugs in the United States, in which black people were being criminalized and targeted for police violence, police harassment. And so Somalis, upon arriving to the United States, did not identify as black, right? They identified with their national identity, but in the United States, blackness is different in the sense that blackness is defined by a one drop rule, right? Anybody who has any black ancestry is considered black, and so you're watching Somalis become racialized as black and become entrapped in the legacy of Jim Crow and anti-black
Hmm.
racism in the United States, right? And so the way it manifested very specifically for Somalis was through SWAT teams, right? Militarized police units breaking down people's doors to deliver search warrants, right? So you can imagine someone who experienced the trauma of war, refugee resettlement, and now has militarized SWAT teams breaking down their doors, right? It's sort of extending to that. And so that was the 1990s. And this is much earlier than the Black Lives Matter movement. So when Mike Brown and Ferguson
Hmm.
happened in 2015, I really argue was the critical moment in now a younger generation of Somalis who grew up in America, who experienced anti-Black racism and police violence is only one manifestation of that, have now understood, unlike their parents, we are Black in America, and that there is this broader movement for what's called the Black radical tradition in this country, and we want to be a
Hmm.
part of that because we can our fate in America and our ability to be free in this country is tied to the fates of other Black people,
Yeah.
including African Americans. So it was really the first time that you see solidarity between African Americans, Somalis, Nigerians, people from the Caribbean, all coming together around the shared theme of
Hmm.
experiencing police harassment and violence and resistance to it. And so now, as of 2025, Somali youth are in leadership positions in Black Lives Matter
Wow.
movement. And what they're arguing for is we need to think about Black Lives Matter not just as an American issue, but think about police violence against Black people as a global and diasporic issue, whether
Hmm.
that be in you know, Paris, Brazil, or Kenya, right?
Yeah.
I think that was the intervention of how young Somalis were actually even changing Black Lives Matter organizing to
Hmm.
think beyond the United States,
Yeah.
right? And so that was kind of their intervention. But yeah, that's sort of how I became interested,
Hmm.
but also my own experiences in America experiencing police harassment as well, right?
Wow.
So it's both as a scholar researching this, but as something that I've also personally experienced. And for many
Mm.
scholars of color, right, it's the sort of the personal is political, right? We part of the decolonial work is to think about how indigenous knowledge and our own knowledge as
Hmm.
scholars are forms of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
objective research is not the only way. in which to produce knowledge and understand
Hmm.
lived reality.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the more radical aspects of the book for me, especially as we see what is happening in Palestine and to Palestinians, is also the formulation of the idea Black Muslim
Mm,
refugee, emphasis here on the Muslim part, because I have been in academia in the US, and I think there is a lot of research at some level on questions of blackness, and but the intersection with the Muslim doesn't always come,
mhm,
you know.
mhm,
And of course, if the war on terror has taught us anything, it's been that the Muslim, you know, whether whatever that is, the Muslim is the public enemy number one. And now
mhm,
I would say like Islamophobia is at reach new levels. I mean, the normalization of anti-Muslim hatred in the media, in newspapers, in just kind of just a general normalization that we see now is I mean, I think I haven't seen it that bad in in a long time. It was really bad after 9/11, and then now it's like it's reached a sort of pitch point, I find. But I think bringing together the blackness and the Muslimness, and then of course we'll get to the refugee bit as well in a minute.
mhm,
But this, I think, is provocative. It's interesting, and I don't know, do you? I firmly believe that the two should be brought together, because these are
mhm,
two extremely precarious identities, and then of course the refugee is an extremely precarious
mhm.
identity. But what are the tensions also between the two, you know? I mean, we are always thinking about anti-blackness within Muslim communities, and then
Mhm.
Islamophobia within Black communities. It's not always a happy marriage, you know. So I want you to just tell me a bit more about that.
I'll begin with the potential for solidarity, right? But
Sure.
also the scholarly insight that that provides, right? So, it's in some ways it's very surprising in the United States, right, that blackness and Muslimness are not thought of together, despite the fact, based on Pew Research, I think as of 2020, 1/3 of all Muslims in the United States are Black Muslims, right?
Amazing.
But these two
Mm,
categories are thought of as completely different. There are Muslims and there are Black people, and that these are completely different communities, right? Who are at the intersections. And so part of what I was trying to do in this work, and there's almost very little scholarship on this, it was very difficult to do, is
absolutely.
to think about how Islamophobia and anti-Blackness not as something that's side by side, but how they inform each other, how
Yeah.
they influence each other, right? And so part of what I was looking at and the way I was able to do it through my scholarship was to show that prior to 9/11 and the heightening of Islamophobia, in particular, that anti-Black racism is sort of what allowed the US state surveillance apparatus to develop, right?
Hmm.
Sort of the wiretapping of Black activists, the surveillance of Black Panthers in the 70s, Dr. King surveillance of his life, right? Where they would call his wife to try to derail their marriage, right? This is sort of state surveillance and state violence, right? Against Black people who were labeled in the 70s as terrorists, right? Um, and so you get to 9/11, right? Islamophobia sort of becomes heightened, right? And so I was really interested in how these systems of violence, particularly Islamophobia and anti-Blackness, are used by the state as a justification for its violence, but also as a way for the state to increase its surveillance apparatus, right? So
Hmm.
after 9/11, the police were getting military equipment as a way to justify police doing the work of counterterrorism, right? And so for me, the interesting thing about thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Blackness is that oftentimes people argue Islamophobia is something that concerns Muslims. Black people should not care about that, or anti-Blackness only concerns Black people. Muslims should not care, and to show that as the state becomes militarized, it impacts everyone, right? And
Yeah.
that the goal between Black and Muslim communities is solidarity, right? But
Absolutely.
more specifically for Somalis, I argued, if they had to organize, can't choose between their Blackness and Muslimness.
Yeah.
We live at the intersection of both. And so if we end Islamophobia, we still have to deal with anti-Blackness. And so that, by taking the Somali perspective, it was a way to think about broader
Mhm.
issues. And just like you mentioned earlier, with Somali refugees and Somalis themselves, right, there is also these tensions between these communities, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that Somalis experiencing experiencing Islamophobia, which I myself have actually experienced,
Yeah.
going to a predominantly Black high school in Columbus, Ohio. Um,
Mm.
from African Americans, right? And then um, going to masjids and mosques uh, and various Muslim spaces, and then experiencing anti-blackness
Ugh.
there, right? And so also how these
Yeah.
communities have the potential to oppress each other. And I really um, like to cite Audre Lorde, is that we can't have solidarity between various communities until we can address how we've oppressed each other, right?
Yeah.
And tackle that issue, and then come together as a community. But yeah, the book was really intended in this way to push scholars of race to think beyond these single categories, right?
Yeah.
And to think about racism as not just single category anti-blackness and Islamophobia, but to think about the ways in which they intersect, because
Yeah.
they really do, not just in the United States, but as you're mentioning, Palestine, but thinking about it on a global front as well, right? In
Mhm.
terms of who's considered disposable, who's considered deserving of empathy, and so on, and so forth. And so I haven't even mentioned the anti-immigrant
Yeah.
sentiment, and
Yeah. Yeah.
refugee,
Yeah.
but that's also central to
Absolutely.
the intervention.
No, absolutely. It is very central to the intervention. But no, thank you for saying that about, the necessity really of solidarity between Black and Muslim communities. I mean, it's a long road ahead. It's very tough, especially given the type of structure of hierarchies and racism that sort of US capitalism generates. So it's like
Hmm.
it's very hard to move within that structure without sort of kicking this one or pushing off that one off
Right.
the ladder. And it's a very tough, it's a tough place, the West. I would say the same for Europe as well. Yeah, let's talk about the bit about the refugees. I think
Yeah.
there is, I think people, a general sort of world, people who have not experienced any kind of migrant movement or mobility in their lives, there's a general sense that they understand what is migration. It might be for economic benefit, it might be to go to university, that
Mhm.
it might be by choice. Um, it's not necessarily fleeing a horrifying condition, right? Whereas
Mhm.
the notion of refugees is, it's fundamental. There's a fundamental precarity that people don't understand, that the world doesn't understand. And for me, what that signals is that as soon as somebody hears refugee camp, they think, oh, the good, sweet humanitarian
Mhm. Mhm.
darlings are helping all these
Right.
refugees, poor things, they're fleeing something. And one of the things that your book makes clear again and again, and it's a hammer that you need to keep at, is the fact that US militarism creates refugees and then shoves them into these horrible conditions in refugee camps, where, and the word here is humanitarian violence, people don't see the relationship between the two. And then when you're lucky enough to be resettled, then you're
Mhm.
thrown back into yet another version of militarism in Europe or in the US, where you're being policed now because you're Muslim or Black and because you're
Mhm.
refugees. Thus, you're probably poorer as well. So, so I think I wanted you to talk a little bit about or dismantle this notion of humanitarianism.
Hmm.
I think we move in a world where humanitarianism remains a good word, but for years
Hmm.
I've been looking at humanitarianism in a critical way, but I can't really can rarely can I convince somebody that humanitarianism is just replete with problems and with violence. So maybe you can say a little bit about that.
This is a very interesting topic to engage in, particularly in the African continent, in
Yeah.
which humanitarianism has had such a colonial origin, right? And
Mhm.
in which African states and African people's rights were sort of so the precursor to humanitarian workers were missionaries, right? Who oftentimes came to educate the Africans during the colonial period, particularly in Kenya and Somalia, and bring Christianity. But ultimately, in the backdrop of a colonial state whose agenda was to exploit state resources and labor, right? And in the present moment, right, there is, as you're mentioning, I'll draw on that thread, a violence associated with something, humanitarianism, whose agenda is supposed to be to alleviate violence for marginalized people, right? So
Mhm.
I think that aspect of humanitarianism is the most shocking for people to understand and interrogate. And there's a really great book by Neda Anataski for your audience called Humanitarian Violence,
Yeah.
right? Which in which she talks about the violence that humanitarian workers can inflict on the people, right? And the violence of that entire system, in which it is ultimately about power and power
Mhm.
differentials between the humanitarian workers, humanitarian agencies, and the people there. But for my broader work, the way I think about this question of humanitarianism and the refugee camp and the shift that I was trying to do um, is two shifts. One is to completely rupture what's considered the rescue narrative, which
Yeah.
is that the US rescues refugees from violence in third world conditions in which violence is considered a normal part of life there, instead of a violence that is created by the legacies of colonialism and state violence, right? And so I teach a course on this, and the way I teach my students uh, uh, this theme, which is very complicated in simple ways, is uh, is to say, imagine someone came to your house, burned down your house, then came back 2 weeks later and said, "I am here to rescue you from this burning house." And as the refugee, you say, "I would have never had to have left my house if you didn't burn it in the first place." And so this is the US, the colonial powers burning Somalia, helping to destabilize Somalia, actually invading Somalia, creating the conditions for that. And so that is the one way in which I was trying to think about what's called militarized refugees. Think
Hmm.
about the global refugee population in the world is really made possible, and Palestine right now is an even more heightened example of this because of
Absolutely.
the heightened militarism and imperialism in our current order, particularly Western imperialism, right? The second shift that is even more critical is to think about the refugee camp not as a humanitarian space, a state space of safety. And think about who's in a refugee camp, people who fled state violence, but to think about it as, this is a fancy term, what scholars call a carceral space, right? That the refugee camp has become in our contemporary era more like a detention center, right?
Hmm.
In the sense that people's freedom of movement is controlled. There's literally barbed wire that encloses people, right? And that houses and detains people who are the most marginalized globally in these spaces, right? And so that's the sort of the second more important shift is to really, and anybody who's been in a refugee camp, very few people have, right? Whether as a scholar, so on and so forth, is jarring entering these spaces to see how controlled, how securitized these spaces are. And oftentimes the narrative for the protection of refugees, but it's oftentimes the states that house refugees wanting to control that population, manage that population, and detain that population, right? And so,
Yeah.
how do we think about humanity? And that is where that is the best example of humanitarian violence, to be enclosed, to have lack of free. And for Somalis, what I didn't do, I didn't go too in depth into this book, but it's very violent. Somalis, most of the Somalis in these camps, many of them are pastoral nomads historically, which means that our entire identity is rooted around movement, moving from
Yeah.
place to place as camel herders, migrating, and then to be entrapped in a physical space in which you
Awful.
cannot move, is antithetical to our entire being, right? And so how do you and of course, freedom of movement is considered one of the main um, rights in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? And that is
Well,
completely. And so, I think that second chapter was intended to really think about policing
yeah.
through the refugee camp, a site in which people don't normally think policing or police harassment or carcerality
Mm,
happens, but it really is. And as imperialism uh, extends globally, as wars become a more common, wars of occupation, wars of domination, wars of exploitation, we'll have more and more refugee populations
I know.
um, that will continue to be housed. So these issues,
And
the
the climate
conditions in which,
as well.
and and exactly, and the current political climate in Europe and in the West, and in Kenya as well, right? It's not just the West, in which anti-refugee sentiment, refugees are
Mm.
not seen any longer as victims deserving as rescue, but as an invading horde, right?
Yeah.
And so, how does that narrative extend the violence
Yeah. Yeah.
committed on these marginalized
Mhm.
communities?
Yeah, I was talking, I meant climate refugees because that's its own
Oh, yes,
other
yes, of course.
madness.
Yeah,
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 but
especially,
yeah,
yeah,
that's a good synthesis. And the book that I have liked quite a bit, and it's a teeny little book by someone named Kelly Oliver called Carceral Humanitarianism, and
mm,
she outlines some of these ways in which states and NGOs work together to increase policing and
yeah,
policing and sort of humanitarian violence within camps and things like that. That basically a camp is, you call it a camp, but really it's a detention center. It's a type of
yeah,
prison. It is carceral or incarceration.
right, right,
So yeah, I mean, and it's really sad when you, I had not thought about that. The idea of the Somali identity as having this sort of nomadic ancestry, this sort of longing for movement, and then they
right,
are entrapped. I mean, this is absolutely devastating. I mean, of course,
yeah,
everybody wants freedom of movement, but uh, I know what you're saying, when it matters collectively, when it's sort of part of your soul,
right,
really, really sad. Um, because I'm unable to kind of stop thinking about this Israel made famine in Gaza. I wanted to talk
yeah,
a little bit. You speak a little bit about food rationing in camps. This is another thing I find people don't know very much about. That, for example, that famines are man made.
yeah,
They're not just always because of drought, but so many conditions that can lead to that. Or the fact that Gaza has been on food rations and calorie counts
yeah,
for several years. So, and now it's escalated to the point that it has escalated. Um, Somalia, of course, experienced horrifying famines to which we can attribute many political conditions. I
right.
just wanted you to like just educate us a little bit about this idea of food rationing in refugee camps, and just generally food precarity, and how that's kind of a political implement, for a violent implement.
Right, right. Exactly. And part of that section of my book, and sort of think about this is it is antithetical to also the idealized view of what a refugee camp, a humanitarian space, right? It's intended to be a space of rescue, right? To most people, the image of a refugee camp is a space where people are being taken care of, people are being fed who are starving, right? And but when you look at the actual bureaucracy and structure of refugee camp, so for example, in the Dab in Kenya, right? Part of the agreement between the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Kenyan state is that the Kenyan state will help operate and host this camp in a way that involves minimal resources on that the Kenyan state devotes, right? And
Hmm.
then of course you then have this situation in which I always try to tell people it's about power and who has power to determine what is good. You have people determining how many calories a typical family should have, right? And
Oh,
so I'm looking at sort of UN documents, a family in the camps should have, and this is for entire family effort, like, 3, 4,000 calories, beans, so on and so forth. And it's a restriction of one's access to food that leads to hunger, a hunger
yeah.
that is not natural, but is created by the structures of both the camp and the Kenyan state and these NGOs. For me, I always tell them, if you reverse that, how would any humanitarian worker or a top level official feel if someone was to dictate to their families how much food they can have in
Hmm.
within a particular period of time. And so, really, as you were mentioning, thinking about food precarity as not something that is just a natural to that environment, right? That starvation is natural to third world spaces, but something that is created by a neoliberal and capitalist agenda that argues that profit is more important over people, right? But also a post-colonial um, system of world order in which, frankly, the lives of indigenous and people of color are seen as not deserving of empathy in the same way, right?
Mm,
Sort of that we're sort of immune and used to the suffering of the darker races, right? Of people of color. This is natural to their condition, and so that's
absolutely.
in some ways, right? Um, what 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 is sort of particularly happening in Gaza, right? Is not just sort of the conditions that create this precarity and lack of food access, but why is there a lack of empathy to these conditions, and why are these
Yeah.
conditions so naturalized, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, again, when we think about white supremacy, and is that suffering of people racialized as white, is given a type of empathy and a type of care that it is
Hmm.
not to sort of colonized and formerly colonized people, right? And so in Africa, it's even more jarring, this food precarity, not just for refugees, but when you
Yeah.
think about the resources the continent has, uh, the most resource-rich continent, uh, coupled with a continent that has some of the largest food precarity as well, right? And
I
so
know.
it's exactly something that is uh, uh,
Yeah.
uh, conditioned.
I feel that way as having grown up in India as well. The chasm is so intense between the ones that just have,
Yeah,
and the amount of agriculture and space and food production, and then the kind of extraordinary poverty and hunger, which is
right.
so systemic. Um, I wanna ask you about. So you were in your book. You say you were a kid, and then you were, about 5 or 6 years old when your family had to be in a refugee camp for some years, and eventually were resettled. Uh, I think to San Diego directly, and I just, I want to know a little bit. I think we know what our stereotypes say of Muslims, in a kind of white
Mhm.
supremacist US culture, or of black people. You know, is there any particular way in which Somalis experience America? You know, is there cultural representations, films, TV shows? You know, what do you think? Are Somalis are part of the American imagination? What did you feel growing up?
Mm. Like, is there a stereotype about Somalis in America?
Yeah, like, you have stereotypes about black people. You have like the
Yeah,
figure of
yeah,
Abu in The Simpsons, which
yeah,
stands for
yeah,
all
yeah,
Indians.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
there stuff like that? I feel that maybe there isn't enough. Maybe there isn't quite. It's not quite solidified. But then again, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I arrived, and my research is in San Diego, but that's not where my family landed. We actually were, oddly enough, the first Somali family resettled to Wheaton, Illinois. This
Wow.
very Christian, predominantly white suburb, right? That the Christian nonprofit organization was resettling not just us,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
refugees from all over the world. And so when we arrived, there wasn't any um, um, sort of imagination or anti-Somali specific sentiments because there wasn't enough Somalis in the country, right? And
Yeah.
Somalia did not exist in the U.S. cultural imaginary. So when we first arrived, right, much of the discrimination that we experienced in the 90s was around
Being black.
Africanness, being
Ah,
black and being African, right? So there
okay.
is sort of stereotypes about Africans,
Of
right, as
course.
starving, as X, Y, and Z, but also very, very specifically anti-blackness, right?
Hmm.
Being mistreated, being accused of being criminal, so on and so forth. Um, and so that was sort of the 90s, growing up in the United States, and that, this is also part of the work that I do. But then, I remember when 9/11 happened, right? I think I
Mm.
was I was in the States, in Columbus, in middle school, if I remember correctly. Yes. and
Mhm.
and so there was our parents came to take us out of the school. Then it became an intense Islamophobia,
Right.
right? And so there wasn't really a specific anti-Somali or Somalis. It was really around our blackness and our Muslimness. And
Mhm.
but the main shift, the biggest shift in the U.S. cultural imaginary of Somalis is actually when the film Captain Phillips came about, and prior to that, the piracy. And so there then became this now,
Mhm.
and this was,
Wait,
mid
when
to late
was Black Hawk
2000s,
Down? That was, I don't remember.
2004.
Okay, even
Yeah,
more.
so
Yeah.
Black Hawk Down was the precursor, and so that was really the first one, right, of sort of
Mhm.
Somali warlords, right? And then when Captain Phillips came, it really added to this U.S. cultural imaginary of Somali piracy,
Yeah.
Somalis as pirates, and of course the broader Islamophobia of Somalis as terrorists, right?
Yeah.
And so, in the United States, um, these are sort of some of the ways in which anti-Somali, not just anti-Black, but specifically anti-Somali racism manifests, right?
Mhm.
Somalis as pirates, as terrorists, um, warlords, not so much,
Yeah.
primarily because of how much has changed since Black Hawk Down, right? But yeah, this is sort of the ways in which the um,
Mhm.
U.S. cultural imaginary sort of conceives of as Somalis. And then in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, right, outside of that, there is this idea of Somalis committing welfare fraud, exploiting state resources, and just as a migrant that's threatening to Columbus's sense of self, right? And so
Yeah.
that is a broader anti-immigrant sentiment that's not specific
Yes.
to Somalis, right? But the specific anti-Somaliness is sort of the piracy, right? That
Yeah,
is
yeah,
the main way, right? And I've even
yeah.
been asked that question about Somali pirates and piracy by ignorant
Why
people,
would you
right? So
have an
that's
answer? Okay. Yeah.
because that is when they understand that is the only context for for understanding Somaliness in this country, right? It's like,
Mhm.
oh, this is the people who are pirates, right?
Yep.
Like I'm saying, Black Hawk Down was big, but Captain Phillips right now has sort of that imaginary, and then also the
Yeah.
news media about piracy in Somalia
Yeah.
has really
Yeah.
extended
Yeah. I
that
think I
racialization.
think now the only bad people who sail the seas now are the Yemenis. The Houthis.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, it
maybe
shifted.
Somalis will get a short respite for a
Right,
while.
from that,
But
yeah.
I hear you on all of this. Yeah, it's really complicated, and it's sort of multiple attacks on so many ways. But let's talk resistance, right? And your book is, even the title has the term
Mhm.
resistance, and you're keen, and this is an extremely important thing that you do, is that you don't render Somalis in Somalia or the Somali diaspora population in North America as passive victims of
Right.
global policing, US militarism, all those kinds of things. And you say that they have developed a repertoire and strategies for engaging with the kind of excessive policing that they experience, and to sort of resist it in some way, to create an activism to push back against it. Can you say a little bit about this? What are you referring to?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, resistance was a really important theme of this book, primarily to disrupt the idea, right, that refugees are merely victims of violence, objects of
Mhm.
rescue that need to be rescued, but to see refugees as complex people, right, people who, even despite the power and lack of power they have, and the tremendous violence and precarity of their condition, have still found ways to exercise agency in their lives, right? And so by doing that, I was really interested in looking at one, the history of resistance, right? So to argue that, as I think I said earlier, right, resistance to state violence is not something new for Somalis. It actually has a much longer history to actually the colonial period, right,
Mhm.
under Italian trusteeship, in which Somalis were organizing, protesting, sort of that occupation, the dictatorship, and but what I really focused on was specifically the from the camps to San Diego, Somalis developed what I call sort of this Somali refugee repertoire, in which they would share resources, share information about upcoming police raids, where police were going to be,
Amazing.
who was going to commit when a police raid was happening, to help the community survive. And so when they arrived to San Diego, they were able to develop that exact same technology, which is called
Mhm.
counter policing technologies, to share information about, okay, where's a police officer going to be, when is a raid going to happen, who's going to be targeted, which neighborhoods or streets to avoid at a particular time.
Brilliant.
And
Mhm.
so for me, it's what I was trying to do is to show that every time the state developed a technology of policing Somalis, Somalis would develop their own counter technology and ways to circumvent that violence. So it's not just resistance in the sense of going to a protest, but resistance as the everyday practices people use to survive and challenge
Mhm.
state violence in both historically and our contemporary moment, right? And
Mhm.
so part of what I was trying to show with that is that one of the strengths of the Somali community is the sense of collectiveness, right? And
Yeah.
so another way I looked at resistance is, if the state is trying to destroy a people, right, marginalize a community, assault a community, right, and then that community finds a way to survive in the context. of that, that itself is a that living and surviving itself in the context of various regimes that want to see that community perish is itself a
Yeah,
form of resistance, right? And so that
totally.
communal survival um, as a form of resistance also became really um, um, a fundamental tenet of my work. But also just look at like when Somalis first came to San Diego in 1990, most people didn't have houses to live in or apartments. And it was really other Somalis who were living in one bedroom apartments that were hosting entirely new families, right? So
Gosh.
Somalis were operating completely outside of the state humanitarian apparatus in the United States, right? Who
Yeah.
was really not helping Somalis in the resettlement process, and then by through this communal, what I call repertoire, survival strategy, sharing of food, resources, that itself is a form of resistance, right?
Mm,
And so to think
absolutely.
resistance beyond simply protests
Sure.
in this way, but the everyday forms of resistance that allow communities to survive, but
Hmm.
that also weaken to some extent these state apparatuses, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And their overall effectiveness in destroying communities, right, or policing communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a little bit on even storytelling as survival, because Somalis, there is such a strong, rich, poetic tradition of oral
Yeah.
histories and sort of orality in general, in terms of creating collective spaces for that kind of thing. And I'm sure, and that too is a sort of beautiful, you know element within the sort of stories of resistance, or just
Right.
sort of surviving with dignity, or not just
Hmm.
surviving, living.
Right. Right.
And at the end, and at the end of the day, your book is about just the sort of virulent nature of policing. Yes, in the US, but we
Mhm.
know it's global, it's worldwide. And your focus is on US policing and anti-blackness, Islamophobia, anti-poorness, you
Right.
know, sexism, all of those kinds of things, how they all intersect to create this grotesque sort of machine.
Right.
And the podcast is titled Radical Futures. So as a final question, how are we is there any hope for radical futures when it comes to the abolition of policing? Are we headed anywhere good, or are we just falling in the pit? And it's never going to change. Where do you find
Y-
yourself when you think about
y-
this?
Yeah, I think there is I think my book ends with the dream of police abolition, right? That a world without police, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this radical future and police violence specifically is possible because of a radical past, right? So in the United States and globally, it's a little different story, right? Police and organized police deputized by city and state officials is actually relatively new in U.S. history, right? So you don't, modern day policing, right, didn't really come about until sort of the 1800s, right? For various scholars, and so I always say if there's a world before policing,
Hmm.
right, and there could be a world afterwards, right? And so um, in many ways, for people it is impossible to imagine a world without police because it's considered
I
so
know.
essential and universal. But I always say that modern day policing, especially in the United States, there's really great scholars on this, didn't really come about very specifically until the end of Reconstruction, right? The sort of late 1800s, the end of slavery,
Mm.
and the Civil War, and the first police officers were historically slave patrols, right? So
Wow.
policing in the United States has a history in slavery, and so the goal, the function of policing is in essence to maintain state power and is in essence to exercise violence against people deemed disposable, right?
Yeah.
And so since that is its essential agenda, right? That police reform has limitations in terms of what it can allow
I
for
know.
people's dignity. So I really do see that all this activism and organizing, BLM exposure is allowing for a future one day in which police is not considered natural and normal, but an aberration to everyday life, and that we
Mhm.
can have a future in which we can organize as a society outside of sort of policing and state violence. And I'll end with Somali indigenous practices, right? So in the Somali community, historically, if someone commits a crime or a violation, people don't go to the police, they actually go to their tribal system,
Yeah.
and so let's say someone murders someone, that the person who commits the murder, their tribe becomes responsible for their actions. So the
Hmm.
community is responsible for, and so you have to trade a certain number of camels to the victim of that family as compensation, right? And so many activists are now talking about restorative justice, transformative justice, but it's a type of justice that is not about punishing an individual, but restoring the community,
Yeah.
right? And allowing for the growth of the perpetrator as well, right? And into society, right? Because punishing, incarcerating, detaining someone, right, doesn't address the more fundamental structural issues that might cause violence, right? That
Yeah.
might cause harm, and so again, there are other ways of engaging with people who commit harm outside of caging human beings, outside of
Mm.
policing people, right? And
Yeah.
so this was sort of the alternatives to policing that people are talking, because people ask, if we end policing, what is the alternative? There's going to just be chaos and anarchy. And I was trying to show that there, and I didn't do this in the book per se, because it's engaged a critique of police, but we've owed this throughout history. There have been alternatives to policing that have existed and
Absolutely.
continue to exist, and that we can function as society outside of that, and sometimes in a healthier way that restores dignity to the victims and perpetrators, right, of harm.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Those are beautiful words to end on, and let's hope everything you say comes true, right? Thank you so
Right,
much
of
for being
course.
here.
Thank you.